On March 17, 2025, in the quiet town of Fairmount, tucked away in the rugged foothills of the Cascade Mountains, a grizzly bear would unleash terror at the local train station, claiming the lives of 5 people. The train was running late, a detail that hardly raised any eyebrows in a town where delays had become a familiar part of everyday life. The platform was mostly deserted, save for a few regulars, old Walter, leaning on his cane, patiently awaiting the arrival of his granddaughter, Lisa, the ticket clerk, absent-mindedly sorting through papers at the window, and Sam, the station manager, going through his usual routine, making sure everything ran smoothly. The stillness of the morning suggested nothing out of the ordinary. Then, just as the clock struck 9:15 a.m., the air changed. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in the wind, almost imperceptible. The birds in the trees fell quiet, as though the land itself had taken notice. Lisa looked up from the counter, glancing out of the small station window that looked toward the tracks. She saw nothing unusual. The usual stretch of barren land, the tracks leading off into the mountains. It was the sort of view that had become background noise over the years. But then, she saw something that made her stop, her hand frozen midair as she was about to pick up the phone. A flash of movement, a large shape moving with terrifying speed across the platform. Sam, still checking his clipboard at the far end of the station, didn't see it. Neither did Walter or anyone else who might have been standing nearby. The creature was fast, too fast to be anything human, too big to be anything familiar. In one heartbeat, it moved past the edge of the trees, into the clearing near the tracks, and onto the platform. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in disbelief. A grizzly, massive, dark and ferocious, it emerged from the tree line with an unnatural speed. Its thick coat bristled with the cold air as it charged forward. The station, that had once seemed so peaceful and calm, was suddenly filled with the sound of its powerful steps. She barely had time to react. Her first instinct was to duck behind the counter, but the bear was already too close. Her pulse raced. The animal was no more than a few feet away now, its eyes wide and full of something primal, something uncontrolled. The station's doors had just been left open to let in the morning air. It was too late. The sound of Walter's cane hitting the floor echoed through the station as he stumbled back, his heart racing. "No!" he cried out, trying to warn the others, but it was already too late. The bear reached the platform, its enormous paws landing with an earth-shattering thud. The train, still not visible down the tracks, was the least of anyone's concern now. The beast roared, a guttural, terrifying sound that could only be described as an explosion of raw fury. Walter fell to the ground, his frail body no match for the chaos erupting around him. And in the midst of the terror, Lisa had the fleeting thought that no one had expected this. A bear here, in the heart of town. It didn't make sense. But it was real. The chaos came in a flash. The bear, driven by hunger or instinct, turned on the station's entrance, ripping through the wooden posts with ease. Sam, who had started to sprint toward the emergency button, was knocked off his feet as the bear turned and charged toward him. The window glass shattered into 1,000 pieces as the bear clawed through it, each swipe sending deadly shards through the air. Lisa screamed, ducking for cover behind the ticket booth, her heart pounding in her chest. Then came the silence, the kind that follows a storm, the kind of quiet you never forget. In that brief moment, the bear paused, its heavy breathing the only sound that filled the air. It was like time itself had stopped, suspended in that one fractured moment. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned, its massive body lumbering back toward the edge of the platform. Lisa could hardly breathe. She was still crouched, behind the booth, her hands shaking as she clutched the counter. The bear's retreat was brief, but the damage it had caused in those few seconds would last forever. The station was wrecked. Sam's body lay motionless on the floor, his hand outstretched toward the emergency button that he would never reach. Walter was barely conscious, blood trickling from his head. Lisa's mind reeled with disbelief, even as the horror of the attack began to sink in. But it wasn't over. The bear hadn't finished. As the growl echoed once more in the distance, the station door swung open once more, this time with even more force. The station was a war zone. Blood soaked the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of fear and chaos. Lisa's ears rang with the sound of her own ragged breath, but the world around her was eerily still. The bear was gone, but the destruction it had wrought remained in every shattered window, every twisted beam. Sam's body lay in the far corner of the station, his face a contorted mask of pain. Walter was still breathing, but barely. His once bright eyes were now glazed over, his body limp as he murmured incoherently. The blood from his head wound stained the floor, a stark contrast against the dull gray of the concrete. Lisa didn't know how she'd managed to get behind the ticket booth, or how long she'd stayed crouched there, trembling, until the silence of the moment hit her with full force. But then there was another sound, the screech of tires. The train was nearing, its arrival marked by the rhythmic clatter of metal wheels on tracks. The same train that was supposed to be her salvation was now just another reminder of the nightmare unfolding around her. She could hear the passengers on board, unaware of the terror just moments away. The station's phone line had been ripped from its mounting, the receiver left dangling like a forgotten memory. Lisa's hands fumbled as she reached for it, but she knew it was useless now. She had to act quickly, but her mind was blank, her body frozen in disbelief. The adrenaline was still coursing through her veins, but it was now mingled with the crushing weight of helplessness. And then, the first of the paramedics arrived, the screech of their sirens piercing the stillness. Lisa looked up, blinking, trying to process the scene. They rushed into the station, their faces masked with professional determination, but it wasn't hard to see the shock in their eyes when they saw the carnage. The first responders immediately moved to Sam's body, checking for signs of life. One of them shook their heads solemnly and turned to the others. "We've got a fatality here." Lisa wanted to speak, to shout, to do something, but her mouth wouldn't move. She just sat there, her hands still shaking, her mind replaying the last few moments like a broken record. The bear's roars, Sam's body, Walter's fall. It all felt surreal, like she was trapped in someone else's nightmare. But as the paramedics worked, more people flooded into the station. The first responders were quickly joined by local officers, their heavy boots clanging against the floor as they moved swiftly through the wreckage. A woman in a police uniform knelt next to Lisa, her voice low and calm. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Lisa shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. I'm fine, but there." Her voice trailed off and she couldn't finish the sentence. Her mind couldn't fully process the weight of the loss. 5 people, just like that. Gone. The officer's expression softened, but she didn't say anything more. She knew there was nothing she could say to make this moment any easier. Instead, she moved toward the body of Walter, checking for signs of consciousness. Lisa didn't watch. She couldn't. The sound of the train pulling into the station made her flinch. The noise that had once signaled the end of a long journey now felt like a death sentence. It would stop, and the doors would open, and passengers would disembark, oblivious to the disaster that had just unfolded. When the doors did open, the passengers spilled out, but they didn't get far. A police officer quickly ushered them back toward the train, warning them to stay inside. More emergency vehicles were on their way, and the area needed to be secured. Lisa saw the familiar faces of locals, people she'd known her whole life, some of them looking confused, others already aware of the horror that awaited them. Minutes passed in a blur of activity. The air was thick with urgency, the smell of gasoline and blood mixing in an unsettling cocktail. Lisa sat, numb, as the first responders worked around her, lifting Walter onto a stretcher, checking the other bodies, assessing the damage. She heard the quiet sobs of bystanders as they were led into a safe area away from the wreckage. News vans arrived, and cameras began flashing, capturing the scene that no one had prepared for. And then, just when it seemed like there was no more room for horror, another sound reached her ears, something that no one had expected. A low, rumbling growl. Lisa's heart stopped. She turned toward the woods just outside the station, where the bear had come from. The sound grew louder, more insistent. The growl turned into a roar, echoing through the trees, and this time it was closer, much closer. The officers who had been directing the crowd froze, eyes darting nervously in the direction of the sound. "Get back inside," one of them shouted, his voice tense. Now, the crowd began to panic, people shoving and scrambling toward the safety of the train. The officers moved to block the station's doors, but it was too late. The Grizzly was back. The growl echoed through the trees, a sound so primal and full of raw power that it sent waves of panic through the crowd at the station. The officers who had just begun securing the area froze in place, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. But there was no time to think. The bear was too close. Lisa's heart hammered in her chest as she ducked behind the ticket booth, her breath shallow, her thoughts a blur of fear and disbelief. The sound of heavy, thunderous footsteps grew louder, closer. The crowd around her started to scatter, people running in all directions, their faces etched with terror as they realized what was coming. "Move! Get inside! Now!" an officer yelled, his voice cracking with urgency. People pushed and shoved toward the train doors, their desperate movements fueled by the instinct to escape. The train had been waiting too long, and now it was their only chance. But not everyone made it. As the bear emerged from the tree line, its massive frame cutting through the brush, the chaos at the station escalated. The first officer, closest to the woods, had barely had time to draw his weapon before the bear was on him. With a single swipe of its massive paw, the officer was thrown backward, crashing into the station's exterior wall with a sickening thud. The crowd screamed, but there was no time to process the horror. People were scattering, running blindly, some tripping over their own feet in the rush to escape. Lisa could barely hear anything over the ringing in her ears. Her mind was a blur of images, the bear's eyes, wide and maddened, locked onto the fleeing people, its movements swift, calculated, and terrifying. It was hunting. "Run!" someone shouted. "It's coming." But the station was no longer a place of refuge. It was a trap. The doors of the train were closing, but the bear was too fast. It was already at the platform, its claws digging into the wooden steps. The doors were sealed, but there was no protection in sight. Lisa's heart pounded as she saw a group of people caught between the train and the bear's path. They were frozen in place, too scared to move. The bear lunged, its roar filling the air, and the first person, a young man with wide eyes, was thrown aside like a rag doll. The bear's jaws snapped shut around his neck before anyone could react, and the crowd screamed again, a collective wail of horror. It was a blur after that. The bear moved with terrifying speed, its massive body barreling through the platform as if it was nothing more than a piece of kindling. The sound of screams and cries for help filled the air, but the bear's growls drowned it all out. There were no more thoughts of escape, only survival. Lisa's legs shook as she huddled behind the ticket booth, praying the bear wouldn't turn in her direction. She didn't know how long it lasted. Minutes, hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the chaos. The bear was everywhere. The officers who had once been so determined to control the situation were now struggling, overwhelmed by the animal's sheer power. Another officer went down with a scream, his body crumpling under the bear's weight. The remaining people on the platform had managed to get inside the train, but the doors were still open. Some of the passengers were crying, others staring in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening outside. The train's conductor was shouting into the radio, trying to contact dispatch, but it was clear that help was still far away, too far away. Lisa dared a glance out from behind the booth. She could see the bear now, its coat matted with blood, its eyes wide and filled with rage. It was no longer hunting for food. This was something else. This was instinct. This was terror. And it wasn't finished. Suddenly, with an ear-piercing roar, the bear turned and bounded toward the group of people who had just barely managed to board the train. The doors were closing, but they weren't fast enough. The bear reached the train with terrifying speed, swiping at the metal door with its claws, sending sparks flying. It was too strong, too powerful. The train shuddered as the conductor tried to force the doors shut, but it was no use. The bear's claws were already through the thin metal. People screamed. The windows shattered as the bear's weight pressed against the doors, and in a final desperate attempt to escape, several passengers jumped for the back of the train, their screams cut short as the bear struck again. Lisa closed her eyes, her stomach turning. She had seen enough. She knew that the bear's rampage was far from over, and in the depths of her fear, she knew there was no way to stop it. Not now. Not in this moment. The bear roared once more before turning and disappearing back into the woods. The echoes of its attack still reverberated in the air as the station stood in stunned silence, the damage done. The paramedics were still arriving in waves, but they couldn't save everyone. The bodies that had once been people were now nothing more than broken pieces of a life interrupted. The officers, too, were overwhelmed, struggling to piece together what had just happened. The town of Fairmount had been forever changed. Lisa sat there, her body trembling, as she tried to make sense of the events unfolding around her. She didn't know how much time had passed, but when she looked around, she realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The Grizzly had left its mark on the town, a mark that would linger long after the blood had dried and the smoke had cleared. And yet, even as the chaos began to die down, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random attack. The Grizzly had come for something, and it hadn't stopped until it had taken everything it needed. The morning after the attack, Fairmount was a town fractured by fear, stunned by an unimaginable violence that had torn through the heart of its quiet, familiar rhythms. The train station, once a simple stop for travelers, had become a grim memorial, a place where lives had been lost in the blink of an eye. The survivors, shaken and silent, sat in a haze of disbelief, waiting for answers that no one could give them. Lisa was one of the last to leave the station. She had been questioned by officers, given statements, but nothing felt real. She was numb. The images of the Grizzly's rampage burned into her mind. She kept hearing the sounds of the people's screams, the low rumble of the bears' growls, and the desperate cries for help. The faces of the victims kept flashing before her eyes. She had lost friends that day, people she had known for years. The townspeople gathered at the town hall that afternoon, all of them looking for some sort of explanation, a reason why this had happened. There were murmurs of shock and disbelief, accusations of neglect, and whispers of some sort of madness that had driven the bear to attack. Sheriff Amanda Dawson stood at the podium, her face weary, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of responsibility. She had never seen anything like this in her entire career. A grizzly bear attacking a populated train station. It defied all logic. Bears, she knew, were wild animals, but they had never been a danger to the town before. The wilderness was miles away, and the people who lived on the outskirts of town knew to respect it. The animals respected them in turn. This attack wasn't random, Sheriff Dawson said, her eyes scanning the crowd. And I won't stand here and tell you I know why it happened, but what I do know is that we are going to find out. Her voice grew stronger. We are working with wildlife experts, state biologists, and experts from the local wildlife center to understand what triggered this bear's behavior. We will get to the bottom of this. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, some relieved, others skeptical. Lisa could feel the unease settle in her chest. The sheriff's words, though meant to reassure, felt hollow. There was a fear here now, a growing uncertainty. Fairmount was a small town, not equipped to handle something like this. What could have driven a grizzly, normally so solitary and distant, to attack like this? As the meeting continued, Lisa couldn't focus on the words being spoken. Her mind kept drifting back to the bear's eyes, the way it had moved with almost unnatural speed, its roar filling the air like an explosion. Something had set it off. But what? 2 days later, a team of wildlife biologists arrived at the station, their faces grim. They had been brought in to assess the situation and to try and understand what had driven the grizzly to attack. They began combing through the surrounding woods, analyzing the bear's tracks, examining the physical evidence at the station, and collecting anything that could shed light on what had happened. By late afternoon, Lisa was standing near the woods, staring at the area where the bear had first appeared. Her hands were still shaking from the trauma, but she needed to understand. She needed to know why. One of the biologists, a young woman named Elena, approached her. "We've found something," she said, her voice low, "something that could explain why the bear attacked." Lisa turned to her, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Elena hesitated, glancing back at the others who were continuing their search in the woods. "We found evidence of something unusual," something the bear was likely reacting to. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The bear was likely sick. It had an injury to its shoulder, and there are signs of infection. But that's not all. Lisa's brow furrowed in confusion. Infection? What do you mean? Elena took a deep breath, clearly trying to piece together her thoughts. We found traces of something, a chemical, or something that the bear had ingested. There's evidence that the bear had been poisoned. Lisa's stomach twisted with a sickening knot. Poisoned? How? We don't know yet, Elena said, shaking her head. But we're doing further tests to confirm it. The bear's aggression, its erratic behavior, it all points to something like that. Something that disrupted its normal instincts. She paused, her gaze fixed on the ground, as if processing the implications of what she had just said. Whatever it was, it drove the bear into a frenzy. It lost its ability to differentiate between threats and people. Lisa felt her blood run cold. The bear hadn't just attacked because it was hungry or driven by instinct. Something had made it lose control, something unnatural. The news of the poison spread like wildfire through Fairmount. The authorities were tight-lipped about the specifics, but it didn't take long for the whispers to start. Some suspected illegal hunting activities in the region. Others feared that someone had been poisoning the wildlife intentionally. But one thing became clear. Whatever had happened, it was not a random attack. It had been the result of something manipulated, something outside of nature's control. The town was on edge. People locked their doors at night, avoided the woods, and kept their children close. The once tranquil town was now suffused with fear, uncertainty, and anger. The bear wasn't just a wild animal anymore. It had become a symbol of something larger, something more dangerous. People no longer trusted the forests or the creatures that called them home. The lines between man and nature had blurred, and they didn't know how to navigate the shifting boundaries as the days turned into weeks. The biologists continued their investigations, trying to track down the source of the poison. But the truth hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Lisa couldn't help but wonder if the bear had been a victim of something much larger than a simple accident. She had seen the bear's eyes, felt the fury in its roar, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the attack was just the beginning of a larger, more insidious problem. She walked through the town one evening, her steps slow and deliberate, the weight of what had happened heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her, their whispers carrying on the wind. She didn't know what the future held, or if the town would ever return to the way it was, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened on March the 17th, 2025, was only the beginning, and Fairmount would never be the same. For the days after the attack passed in a haze of uncertainty and fear. Fairmount had been shaken to its core, its peaceful exterior shattered by the violence of that morning. People went about their routines with caution, but the weight of the tragedy hung over everything. It wasn't just the lives that had been lost. It was the very idea of safety that had been stolen. The grizzly bear, once a symbol of the untamed wilderness, had become an embodiment of something much darker. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The bear's aggression, its unnatural behavior, had rattled her. The realization that it had been poisoned, driven to madness by something it had ingested, twisted at her gut. The more she thought about it, the more she wondered, who would do this? Why would anyone poison a bear? The biologists had done their tests, but the results had come back inconclusive. There were traces of a chemical in the bear's blood, Something toxic, but no clear explanation of how or why it had been exposed. A slow burn of anger began to build inside Lhasa as the town searched for answers that seemed to slip further away the more they tried to find them. It was early April when the first real breakthrough came. Elena, the biologist who had been working with the wildlife experts, called Lisa late one evening. Her voice was low, urgent. "Lisa, I need you to come to the station. Now." Lisa felt her heart race as she grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. She didn't ask questions. She couldn't. Whatever Elena had found, it couldn't wait. When she arrived at the station, Elena was waiting for her, her face drawn and tired. "It's worse than we thought," Elena said, barely letting Lisa catch her breath. The bear wasn't the only one exposed to the poison. Lisa's heart dropped. "What do you mean?" Elena led her into the back of the station, where the biologists had set up a temporary lab. The room was filled with charts, maps, and small vials of blood samples. A local chemist had joined the team in their efforts to track down the poison, and what they had uncovered was horrifying. "We've been testing local wildlife," Elena explained, pointing to a chart of blood samples, "and we've found more animals with traces of the same chemical. It's in the deer, it's in the elk, and it's in the water." Lisa's mind spun as the words sank in. "The water?" Elena nodded grimly. "There's something leaching into the rivers, the streams. The animals are drinking it, and that's why the bear went into a frenzy. It wasn't just hungry or territorial, it was poisoned, just like the others." Lisa's chest tightened. Who would do this? Who's poisoning the animals? "I don't know," Elena said quietly, "but it looks like someone's been using the river as a dumping ground. Waste, chemicals, the kind of stuff that's meant to stay hidden. It's not just affecting the wildlife, it's affecting the people too." Over the next few days, the news spread like wildfire through the town. Tests showed that the chemical compound in the river had made its way into the local water supply, poisoning not just the animals, but the very land that Fairmount had been built on. The town's agricultural products had been contaminated, and with the water supply tainted, many of the residents were unknowingly drinking from the same poisoned source. It was clear now. The grizzly bear's attack wasn't a random act of nature. It was the result of something much larger, something much more insidious. Someone had been dumping toxic chemicals into the river, poisoning the land, the water, and the creatures that lived off it. Sheriff Dawson, now fully aware of the scale of the disaster, launched a full-scale investigation. It wasn't long before the authorities traced the source back to a local logging company. The company had been disposing of waste improperly, dumping chemicals and industrial runoff directly into the river. The bears, the elk, the deer, all of them had fallen victim to the toxins, their instincts corrupted by the poison they had unknowingly consumed. The company's executives denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. The toxic chemicals were linked to a factory outside of Fairmount, and it became clear that the company had been violating environmental regulations for years. The bear's attack, it seemed, was a tragic side effect of their greed. In the weeks that followed, the town of Fairmount came to terms with the tragedy. The logging company was held accountable, facing severe fines and criminal charges. The company's reckless actions had cost the lives of 5 people, and it had nearly destroyed the fragile peace the town had enjoyed for decades. The environmental cleanup efforts began immediately, and the town worked together to restore what had been lost. But for Lisa, the scars of that day ran deeper. She had seen the destruction firsthand. The devastation that one bear's frenzy had left in its wake was something she would never forget. And though the company was being held accountable, there was a part of Lhasa that knew that no punishment could ever bring back the lives lost, the families torn apart by that single act of nature gone awry. Months later, as the town began to rebuild, the memory of March 17th, 2025, still lingered. The train station was repaired, the tracks were cleared, and the victims were memorialized in a quiet ceremony by the river where it all began. Lisa stood there, looking out over the water, the once poisoned river now slowly healing. The grizzly bear, its rage driven by something no one could have predicted, had changed everything. The town, the people, the land. It had all been touched by something bigger than anyone had anticipated. But in the end, it was the survival of the land, the will of the community to restore what had been taken from them, that would define the future of Fairmount. The bear had come for something it didn't understand. It had attacked out of instinct, but the town had fought back with its own. The will to survive, to endure, and to protect those they loved. And though Fairmount would never be the same, it had learned the hardest lesson of all. Nature, wild and untamed, cannot always be controlled, but it can always be respected.